Okay, good evening, and this is the fourth week of our New Testament survey here at Generation School of Ministry in 2019. And we've got a lot of material to go over. We've got our lesson tonight, of course, from chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then I have a couple of other things I want to go over. And I have the study sheets for the final exam. These are study sheets that you'll be able to study with, but that'll be a little later, okay? So one of the things I want to point out is on your syllabus. Since this is the first time I've ever taught this class, and also because we've had different textbooks through the years, you know. One of the things on the course objectives is identify 5 nations, 10 cities, and 5 bodies of water related to New Testament times. Well, in our textbook, I wasn't able to find exactly those things just like that in a list or an order. I'm sure it's all recorded in there, of course. But I just, made a list of some of the prevalent nations at that time, and I'm going to make sure this is, they can see the blackboard here. Okay, the students who are watching on Zoom. 5 of the prominent nations, make sure I can, was Rome, of course, Greece, or the Greek nation, the Roman nation, the Greek nation, the Jewish nation, and the Syrian nation, even though they were under Roman rule. We're talking about, influence here, and the Egyptian nation. So those are 5 prominent nations at the time of Christ that were close to Israel there, okay? And I want to make sure that they can see this. Let me see if I go, no, it's got to go this way, okay. And then 5 bodies of water. So some of you can help me here that are significant there in Palestine at that time.
Galilee, or Sea of Galilee.
The Sea of Galilee.
Dead Sea.
Okay, the Dead Sea. What else?
Mediterranean. Black Sea.
No.
The Red Sea.
The Jordan River.
Oh.
The Jordan River. These are bodies of water. And the Dead Sea. Oh, we already got the Dead Sea. Yeah. And the we could put the Euphrates, but also one already mentioned the Red Sea. Actually the Jordan River is responsible for the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the Red Sea. It goes underground and then comes back up. But anyway, these are 5 bodies of water that were significant in that time in Palestine in the times of Jesus. And another thing that we want to see is, I'm trying to make this, it kind of looks backwards here, but maybe they're seeing it okay. I don't know.
It's because the trimmer mirrors.
Okay, and then the 4 general sections of, sections of Palestine. The 4 general sections of Palestine are 1, Galilee. Nazareth was in Galilee. 2, Samaria. Samaria had been the capital of the northern kingdom. You know, when the kingdom split, Samaria was the capital, and that's where the mixed race of people, where the Jews had intermarried with a lot of other people, and that's why they looked down on them. Okay, Judea. Judea is the area where Jerusalem was, and 4, Perea. It was the land on the other side of the Jordan that had belonged to Israel. So Perea. Oh, I think there's an A in there. Yes, there is. Another A. Okay. And the one of these that was the largest populated was Galilee. Galilee was the largest populated, and it was the, it had the most tradesmen and like middle-class businessmen, you know. In Judea was down here where the high society Jewish people lived. There were poor people down there too, but the upper echelon of the Jewish scribes and those people lived in Judea. They looked down on of course they looked down on the Samaritans, but they looked down on the Jews that lived in Galilee, because Galilee was populated with a lot of Gentiles. And it was like a melting pot, like America. Galilee was a big melting pot. Even though Samaria had Gentiles, Samaria was mostly half-breed Jews. That's what Samaria was made up of. And so Galilee had a lot of just Orthodox Jewish people there, but they lived among the Gentiles too, and they were tradesmen. They were like blue-collar workers and middle-class businessmen and that kind of thing. And that's where James and John and Peter and Andrew, most of all of Jesus' disciples, grew up there, and that's where he grew up, in Galilee. And the Judeans, the Jews from Judea and around Jerusalem, looked down on the Galileans, the Jews from Galilee. They were like lower-class people, okay? And none of them would have anything to do with the Samaritans. Okay, so, and then 10 significant cities, and I just listed 10. I don't know, let's see, I can maybe list them over here on this side. Take this off now. Okay, so, of course, we know, so that you'll know, you'll just be able to, and you know these, of course there's Rome, 2, Jerusalem, 3, Damascus, this was in Syria, and 4, of course, Samaria, and 5, Caesarea, 6, there was Caesarea Philippi too. That's where they were when Jesus asked him, "Who do you say that I am?" Okay, and then of course Decapolis. Decapolis was a network of 10 cities. Deca means 10, and polis means city. Okay, in Greek. Okay, so 8, Jericho, famous city, and that's where the in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he talked about the Good Samaritan traveling to Jericho, and then 9, of course, Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Bethlehem of Judea. So Bethlehem was in Judea and the area there. There are other little cities there, but Bethlehem, and then of course, can't forget Nazareth in Galilee. Yeah, significant cities. So I'm not sure if these were the exact ones that we were to identify, but I know that at least these is most of them, okay? And so I just wanted to go over that briefly with you all. And okay, all right. Let's look at our lesson tonight. And let's see, excuse me just a moment. I'm gonna okay, thank you. This all these down. Tonight from chapter 4, we're looking into the background of Judaism more closely, and Jewish literature and how it influenced Judaism. But I want to read you a quote from page 116. On page 116 of your textbook, and I got to put this back now so that, yeah, there, okay. Judaism was based on the conviction expressed in the opening words of the Tractate Abath, which if you read, about Jewish literature, you would look up Abath and that part of his writings. And I'm quoting from that. They're quoting from that in the book. Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua. And Joshua committed it to the elders, and the elders committed it to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to the men of the great synagogue. The law was given by God to Moses. The law that was given to God by Moses had been faithfully preserved through the ages and was the foundation for the faith and life of Judaism. And that's absolutely true. Okay? And but it was also added to it. So we want to understand the key theological emphases of Judaism at the time of the rise of Christianity, because they are reflected in the teachings of Jesus and the early disciples. All right, so we're going to look at I'm just briefly going to mention these because you've got your textbook and you can read up on this, and we don't have time to go through in detail what this is, so I'm just going to mention it. Jewish literature from the time of 200 BC, before Christ, to AD 200, after the birth of Christ. And the Apocrypha, and of course we've talked about the Apocrypha before. That was one of the related writings that were based on biblical writings and based on biblical characters, but they weren't included in the canon of the Old Testament or the New Testament, the Apocrypha. Then the pseudepigrapha, okay. I looked this up. It's so cool. You can look this up on I was going to show this to you. Let me see if I can pull it up. Oh no. Well, maybe I can do it later. Anyway, you look that word up on Google or whatever, and there's a voice telling you exactly how to pronounce it. So anyway, pseudepigrapha is not also non-canonical books. They were not included in the canon, and it lists all these on pages 117 and 118, all these Apocrypha and pseudegrapha books, okay? So they're just based on already the sacred writings of Judaism, Then there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we talked about that last week. It is the most significant manuscript find ever made. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the most significant manuscript find of the scriptures ever made. because copies of the books that were considered canon, the canonical books of the Old Testament, copies of them were copies of every book of the Old Testament that is included in the canon was in those finds. Not the entire book, but parts of every book was preserved, and they found it there except for Esther. Esther, the book of Esther was the only one not found among that. Copies of the Apocrypha and the Pseudegrapha, and also documents relating to the life of the community there, the Qumran community of the Essenes, which we believe it was the Essenes there, which that was important because it told us how they lived. It was like a little journal of, we did this day, we did this, here's was our schedule, we had this to eat, we and we had prayers at this time, and so that was very important because it showed the life of the community and what they did and how they worshiped God, and their their manner of community and how they related to one another, and some people were expelled if they didn't go by the rules of the community, everything about it. Another part of Jewish literature at this time was the writings of Philo of Alexandria, which we mentioned him last week. He was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, okay? So Hellenistic is the Greek influence, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher. So Philo, he used philosophical allegory to harmonize Jewish scripture from the Torah with Greek philosophy. So he harmonized the scripture with Greek philosophy. And he adopted allegorical interpretations of the scripture instead of literal interpretations. And that's significant because we have the same thing today with liberal theologians. Instead of interpreting the Bible literally as it's written, then it has some other allegorical meaning, or it's mixed with some other philosophical meaning. And then the writings of Flavius Josephus. Okay, Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was very educated. He was a very educated Jewish man, and a lot of the Jews were being persecuted during his time and martyred. But because of his intelligence and his education, the emperor decided to use him there in the palace as one of his personal assistants, and writing this history. So he wrote the Jewish history, and a lot of things in the Josephus's writings tell us so much background of what was going on and what happened, and so it was really important. One of the things that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls showed us is the similarities discovered between the Qumran community, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and how they lived and everything, and the early Christians. And that comparison is on pages 120 to 124 in your textbook. So it's like 5 pages of comparisons between how this Qumran community lived, and they were very devout, very moral, wanted to have a purity of life toward God, very dedicated. And the Christian community, many of the things were the same. Anyway, it gives a comparison there. Some of the things were different, of course. All right, that's kind of a quick little view there of chapter 5. Now in chapter 6, the reason I'm going through this so fast is because we got to go over the exam study sheet, and we want to have time for that. The New Testament, let's see, I've got myself, let me get this, okay. The New Testament name and contents from chapter 6. The word New Testament is from a Latin word, Novum Testamentum, which means last will and testament. And if someone's going to leave a will, in order for it to go into effect, they have to what? They have to die. No will, yeah. If you make a last will and testament, it's great, it's fine, it's in a file somewhere, your lawyer has it, you have a copy, whatever, but it doesn't go into effect until you die. How is that significant with when Jesus came on earth? The New Testament, his last will and testament, didn't go in effect until he died and was resurrected. But I mean, he had to die first for that to go into effect. So we have a New Testament or New Covenant, which covenant is from the French word convenir, to agree. And that word implies more than a promise. In other words, the New Covenant isn't just a promise. It's more than a promise. It's a last will and testament, you see. Okay? And let's talk for a moment just about the difference between a covenant and a contract. In your book, he talks about this being like a contract. But really, a covenant is not a contract. It is way more binding than a contract. And it has to be a covenant. If you study covenant from ancient times, it is solidified not by a signature, it's solidified by blood, by the shedding of blood. Okay, so when God made a covenant with Adam and Eve, what did he tell them in the beginning? If you eat of this one tree, you can have all these other fruit. You can have all this other fruit and everything else in this garden except this one here in the middle of the garden. This is the one you can't have. Okay, it's the knowledge of good and evil. That was their choice. That was their, they could choose to obey God and, anyway. So we know what happened. But he said, if you eat of this tree, the words aren't there, but we understand what happened. They broke the covenant with God because he said, if you break this covenant with me and disobey, you will what? Die. Well, they didn't immediately physically die that day, but spiritually they died that day and lost the glory of God. They lost the Spirit of God on the inside of them. They were alive human beings created by God, but they were no longer in communication with God, in fellowship with him, and they had broken the covenant with him. Okay, and so covenants, like a marriage covenant, and not so many Christian people do now still, but not so many people, secular people, they don't even have it in the terms anymore, in vows that say, until death do us part. But that's what covenant means. It can only be broken by death of one of the other parties, you see? So, in other words, if you break the covenant, then it calls for your death. That's how much stronger a covenant is than a contract. A contract can be broken pretty easily, as we all know in this day and age. Okay, and that's why divorce is a big thing. All right, doesn't mean if you're a divorced person or if you come from a divorced family, it doesn't mean you're horrible or less than, but it just tells you that a covenant is not just a contract. Okay, and God, the old covenant was broken by the people. They broke their side of the covenant, and in fact, more than once. And finally, it was beyond repair. So they're called for a new covenant that was bought by the blood of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that Jesus, he would not break that covenant, and it would stand good for all of us. In other words, I could go on teaching about this for a while, but I got to go on. But anyway, so a covenant is a relationship. It's relationally based. It's based on relationship. not on legal. There are legal terms in a covenant, just like in a contract. There are legal terms, but it isn't just based on those legal terms. It is based on a relationship, and you keep your promise or your covenant with that person because of your relationship. You would not dishonor them by breaking the covenant. You would not be disloyal to them by breaking the covenant. You would not, you wouldn't quit loving them no matter what because of the covenant, you see. And God displayed that over and over and over through the ages toward his people and toward the people of the world. And somebody says, well, Jesus came so the Gentiles could come into the church. That's true, but remember that all through the history of Israel, from the very inception, when it became a nation, so to speak, under Moses, under Moses' time, they always included anyone that wanted to be a part, like Rahab and Ruth and many, many others that are not even named. Anyone who would come into the Jewish community and take the vows and ascribe to the laws and live, make the promises toward God and keep his commandments and do all the purification and the sacrifices and everything, they were accepted just like everybody else. Okay. And in the New Testament, we see the whole Gentile population able to come into the church. So anyway, God never, ever left anybody out, really. It's, people, so many people don't even know who God is or know what he's about, of course. And, but that's part of our assignment, is to make the Father known and to let the world see Jesus in us. Okay. The New Testament is the record. This is in chapter 6. The New Testament is the record of the character. It's the record of the character and establishment of a new dealing of God with mankind through Christ Jesus, the promised Messiah. Okay. Now, since Jesus is not going to break this covenant, it's the period of grace. All right. Which is a whole nother teaching. Okay, you guys are going to have to, this is just, whetting your appetite, okay. The contents of the New Testament consist of the revelation of this new covenant through the recorded words of Jesus through his followers. So the contents here in the New Testament consist of the revelation of this new covenant through the recorded words of Jesus through his followers. There are 27 books, and I can write that up here. Okay. There, it did stay open, good. Okay, there are 27 books, 8 to 9 authors. We'll talk about that in a minute, the 8 to 9. And what's the other one? Where am I? And written basically from AD 45 to 100. I mean, this is as close as they can, get it. So we've got 27 books, 8 to 9 authors, written from AD 45 to 100, roughly speaking there. And then there are 3 classifications of the books. There are literary character of the books. Maybe there was another word. Okay, the literary character. 2, they can be grouped by authors, 3 is periods. They can be grouped by the period they were written in. And you have charts there in your book on pages 131 to 133. There's charts there where they they tell about these different groupings and they show a chart about it, Okay. So that's like a brief synopsis of chapter 6. And now let's look at chapter 7. The Gospels as literary works, okay? The 4 Gospels contain authentic records of the life of Jesus. They contain authentic records of the life of Jesus, but these books and these records are not exhaustive, of course. Remember the last verse of John? He said, of the book of the Gospel of John, he said, if all the miracles and doings of Jesus were written, well, it said all the books in the world couldn't contain it, he said. Okay? And I mean, look at the brief accounts we have of all this. Okay? So they're authentic records, but they're clearly not exhaustive. Each author of the Gospels, now we're talking about the Gospels right now, each author of the Gospels had its own focus and purpose. Okay? The first 3 Gospels are similar accounts, therefore they're called synoptic Gospels. We mentioned that in another lesson, which means similar. It's a word that means similar. So the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are synoptic Gospels. Okay, and then we get to the problem called the synoptic problem. Okay, the reason that we're going over this and the reason that this is important is we are in a world of secular people, historians, theologians, different people that have different persuasions and beliefs, and they've heard this and they've heard that, and there are many theologians that actually don't even know the Lord personally, but they're a theologian and a pastor or a minister or they teach in a seminary, and there are even some, believe it or not, theologians in seminaries that are atheists. They've got, at Harvard, that was once a school of divinity, the whole thing. It wasn't for any other purpose. You've got atheists who teach theology there. You got atheists that teach theology at Berkeley in their school of their seminary. And other, schools, seminaries. I mean, think about it, okay? All right. So if you as a pastor or minister, whatever, in ministry, you don't know, you're too naive. Naive is a good thing in some cases, to be childlike and naive, but in other ways it is not, because you're not prepared for what's going to come against you. Okay, so that's why we go through this, and that's why all this stuff is in there. You think, I thought I was taking a book about the New Testament, and here we're learning all this other stuff. I won't say the word you might have thought, but anyway, so the synoptic problem. Okay, the synoptic problem. Why do they resemble each other so closely? This is one of the questions, even to exact verbiage in many places. The 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those 3. Why do they resemble each other so closely, even to exact verbiage in many places? Okay, this is in chapter 7. That's one of the questions. So number 1, they came up with this theory called the oral tradition theory. The oral tradition, and the Jews practice oral tradition. They repeated the law verbally over and over again in the synagogues to their children. They taught it verbally and they read it orally over and over, and they would pass things down orally still to this day. Even in the Psalms were sung over and over and chanted, and some of the scriptures from the Torah were chanted and sung over and over, So the oral tradition theory. the messages, Jesus' messages, were preached first before they were written. And that's a very reasonable conclusion. That the disciples who became the apostles, and then, Jesus, after the 12, he commissioned 70 more. Okay? Well, the people that were following him, 70 came from all those crowds that were following him. So there were multitudes of people following, period, besides the 70 and the 12. So they heard him preach these messages, and many times he preached the same message more than once because he was with a different group of people. So then they took those same messages and they preached them and preached them and preached them. The disciples would preach them over again. They would preach the messages of Jesus before they were ever written down. And so it was all like they heard, it's the same messages being preached by them over and over and over again. And they had heard them over and over again, and they preached them over and over again. Okay, these same disciples, okay? And then also, with this oral tradition theory, with constant oral repetition, the story becomes stereotyped and memorized. That's one reason for the Matthew, Mark, and Luke having some of the same verbiage. Okay, another theory about why they were so similar, and even though they were different in many ways, but like using the same verbiage in many places. The second theory was the mutual interdependence theory. Interdependence theory. This is in your book there in chapter 7. Two of the Gospels, they say, borrowed from the other. So 2 Gospels borrowed from the other. But this theory destroys the originality of the 2 Gospels that copied from the third. So there was a problem with that. Also, under this theory, the interdependence one, if Matthew copied from Luke, let's say, why is there a different order of events and have so many omissions, different places? Okay, these are the questions. Another theory was the documentary hypothesis theory, originally called the two documentary hypothesis. Okay, a lot of big words, but it's in chapter 7 there. Around, let's see what, page 140. Around page 140. Let's look there to make sure. Yes, 141. Okay, if you have your book, this stuff is on page 141. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis theory, this theory assumes that Matthew and Luke built their Gospels on the basis of Mark, plus a collection of the sayings of Jesus called Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source. Okay, so this theory assumes that Matthew and Luke built their Gospels on the basis of Mark, along with a collection of the sayings of Jesus that they term source, or the German word Quell, which came to mean Q. They just abbreviated it, and it's Q stands for Quell, which stands for source. But this source is assumed with no written documentation. There is absolutely no document labeled Q. So that's why they think it's a collection of his sayings that they all just heard. And that's why there's no written documentation, and that it was oral. Okay? And a lot of people adopt this theory, a lot of theologians, because they say this accounts for the differences and also the same verbiage, because Mark is reproduced, the Gospel of Mark is reproduced almost completely in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke contain completely all of Mark, maybe in a different order, but it's there. Although Matthew and Luke differ greatly from each other, but Matthew and Luke do agree about what is significant in Mark, and they have it included in their gospel. Okay? So this is, to me, it's like Dr. Cook and I, we have the same, we can teach some of the same classes, okay? But he's going to take a different approach than I do. And I may use some of the same words. I may use from the same source of a textbook. I'm going to bring out some things that really stick out to me or that I remember that maybe he doesn't, or, you know, and he's going to, but it's going to be, we're going to be talking about the same thing from the same sources, actually from the same, you know, valid sources. And also, all of us know that even in a courtroom, they have eyewitnesses, and every eyewitness will see something different. And some of the eyewitnesses will see the same thing. Some of the eyewitnesses will, that depends on how many they have, may see a few things exactly the same, but then one of them notices something the other one doesn't notice, and vice versa, whatever. And it happens all the time. And no one questions that. But you have all these people and liberals and theologians and doubters saying, well, why is this kind of seem, why is all these books similar and they almost use the same verbiage? It sounds like, it really isn't valid. So that's the big controversy. Anyway, there were two big schools that grew up from this in Germany, because this is where the Reformation came from. That we're talking about coming down through the centuries with theologians, and then the Reformation. I can't pronounce this German word, Form des Kitschy something. It means form history, the form history school. And this school adopted the theory that the sources of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because this is a synoptic problem. They call it the synoptic problem. The sources were compiled from anecdotes about Jesus and from fragments of his teaching. That the authors took these anecdotes and teachings from fragments of his teaching and compiled this into their book, okay? But then this other group, this is also in Germany, the Redaktion Geschi, whatever they're called. Anyway, the redacted group. Redacted is to shape or redo, to change. And they believe the writers of the New Testament or of the Gospels were more like creative writers than just compilers. And they were interpreters, not collectors. In other words, they put their own slant on whatever it was. And of course, we don't believe that. And one reason why is because of the fact that there is a lot of the same verbiage exactly like it is restated again from Mark and Matthew and Luke. That tells us something, that they did not want to change what they knew and remembered that Jesus said and taught, and what he did and what they saw. And they kept it, they kept it just like it was, and they could verify it with each other, especially John Mark, who was an understudy of Peter, and Matthew was a disciple, John was a disciple, right, that followed Jesus. Luke had to depend on, he wasn't an eyewitness to some of Jesus' teaching, but he heard the messages through these other people and was traveling with disciples, and of course traveled with Paul, and used the accurate reports from Mark. Okay? Anyway, so what we want to look at is that none of these theories here have proved sufficient to account for the origin of the Gospels. Much more evidence is needed, but here's what's reasonably certain. Okay, here is what is reasonably certain. Number one, Matthew represents the notes that Matthew took on Jesus' teaching, which closely resembles Mark, which is understandable since they both were with Jesus. You know, Mark was not one of the 12 disciples, but he was he was alive at the time. He was a young boy growing up, or a young teenager, because in the book of Acts, you read about John Mark traveling with Paul and Barnabas. Okay, he traveled he went with them on the first missionary journey, or part of it, you know, and he got discouraged and left. But he was a young adult by this time. So his mother was a follower of Jesus. His mother was Mary, the one where they were holding the prayer meeting for Peter, as you read about in the book of Acts. Okay, so anyway, Mark was close. So it was understandable that here Matthew had been a disciple and Mark had been out in the multitude many times. All right, Mark, the book itself represents the main line of narrative preaching about Jesus. It was, and oh, by the way, Matthew was the target audience was the Jewish people. Matthew's target audience was the Jews. And one of the reasons we know that is because he started out with the lineage of Jesus. He gave the lineage of Jesus all the way down to Joseph. All right? So his target audience, and how the angel came to Joseph and to Mary, or mostly to Joseph in Matthew. So his audience was Jewish. Mark represents the main line of narrative preaching about Jesus. It was written while some of the apostles were still living, and its contents were known early on. A lot of theologians believe that Mark was the first book written. Some believe it was Matthew. Some believe Matthew was the first book written.
What do you believe? What do you think?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I think Matthew was the first book that was written, but I'm not. So that puts me my husband thinks Mark was the first book written. So right there, you see, everybody's their own individual person, and who knows? What's amazing to me is that Jesus never wrote the book himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then he didn't tell his disciples, hey, be sure and write this book about me after I'm gone. Be sure taking notes while I'm, so you can document this right, so I can be famous. Yeah. And I mean, just think about it. When he told people, don't tell anybody about this miracle. Mm-hmm. Don't tell anybody.
It's like, don't push the little red button. Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons is, I can tell you, I mean, the Lord, of course, his humility, and he wasn't out to make a big name for himself, but just think about it. The longer he ministered and the more miracles that were done, the more that his life was in danger. And there was a certain time that he had to die, and not before that. He had to die on that day. And he didn't want to compromise that, so.
He ducked out a couple.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
He was like, I'm out.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not getting stoned.
Exactly. All right.
Because,
so, yeah, he knew the appointed time of his death, and it had to be that exact time in history, okay? Mm-hmm. And so he was very cognizant of that, and so he would tell people, don't spread this around, don't spread it abroad, Okay. at one time, when he cast the demons out of the guy with a legion of demons,
Mhm.
and that guy wanted to follow him, be one of his disciples, and he says, "No, go back to Decapolis, where you're from, to your family," which I'm sure they didn't know where he was or what was, they'd not heard from him, and who knows when. Poor guy. And he said, "And tell them what great things God's done for you." Now, he told him to go back and tell, because that was cities where the Lord didn't go at that time, because it was a Gentile population pretty much. And he was sent to the Jew first, And anyway, the Lord was very aware of his mission and his purpose, and he had to stick to that, right then, and finish and fulfill the old covenant that had never been fulfilled by anybody else. He had to fulfill it and then bring in the new one. Okay. Luke, did I tell you that Mark's audience was Roman? The audience for the book of Mark is the Roman audience. And he doesn't tell a bunch of history about Jesus as far as his birth or his Jewish roots or anything. His audience was the Roman audience. Okay, and the Roman Gentiles. Luke, the book of Luke represents the independent account of Paul's traveling companion. Luke was a physician. He was a doctor, and he traveled with Paul. And Luke was probably written in the 7th decade of the 1st century. And he incorporated the narrative preaching and all that he had heard and known from Mark or Matthew or whoever, and his own research. And when you read the book of Luke, you note that he has more details about their illnesses, because he was a doctor. He was a physician. So he explained some of those things, and that the others did not, And, another thing about like Matthew, Peter, Andrew, all the other disciples, most of them were uneducated, unlearned men. I mean, even when in Acts, when they come before, the Sanhedrin there, and they're wanting to, stone them or whatever for the miracle of the, of the crippled guy at the temple, they say, "These are unlearned men, but we can see they've been with Jesus, and how can they do these things, okay?" And boy, they still didn't get it, did they? But anyway, so one of the things that I see is for these mostly, now Luke was educated, but for these unlearned men to write these accounts and they be as accurate as they are and stand up against each other like they do, I mean, it's amazing to me. Okay, so Luke's audience was also Gentiles, but it was the Greeks. His audience was the Greeks. So, and of course, the Gospel of John was written much later. It was the last, we do know that the Gospel of John was the last book, not book, but gospel to be written at the toward the end of John's life. And it had a wide audience to Jews and Gentiles, just to everyone, okay? So there are many theories on how these Gospels became, I've got to hurry, how these Gospels became diverse, yet similar. So the Gospel should be treated as honest attempts. I'm getting my other audience. Sorry, you guys. Sorry. I didn't turn it around. Okay. The Gospel should be treated as honest attempts to arrange the life of Jesus for doctrinal and educational purposes. They were honest attempts to preserve and write down and arrange the life of Jesus for instructional purposes. The purpose of these evangelists, which is the disciples, the apostles, the ones that wrote this, the purposes of these men must be taken into account. They possess much material in common, especially the 3 synoptic gospels, but they put it to different uses. They organized it differently under the direction of the Spirit. They also had different target audiences, every single one of them. And when you think about the 4 gospels, all of them, not just the synoptic, every single one of them with their purpose and their targeted audience, they bring out something here and there that the other ones do not, and you get the full picture from all 4. It's just amazing, okay? So the very differences of these authors speak of independence and yet continuity, and not just rote copying. Also, the similarities reflect, number 1, a common background of information. They had a common background and pool of information, a common subject of writing. Their subject was centered on the Lord Jesus Christ, his life, his purpose. That was the common subject of writing. And 3, they also shared the common inspiration of God. That inspiration is on those words or on those writings. The inspiration of the Spirit of God. Okay? And so that is basically a quick synopsis of chapter 7. And as you finish your journal assignment for the rest of the book, that helps you to go through and know a little bit about each book and just its basic, author, time of writing, background, outline, so that's what you're going to be turning in next week, okay? In the remaining parts of this textbook about the remaining New Testament books, okay?
You wanted the journal on the books of the Bible that we're reading, right? Or the text out of this?
It's on the books of the Bible, but you find the answers to those questions.
Okay, I'm just making sure because I was like,
Okay, but look, let's look here. Look on your syllabus. On the back, number 3, journal. Due to the brevity of this course, rather than completely read the rest of the textbook, the student is to glean from the text the following information in regards to each New Testament book. So you're going to make a little, you're going to have a little thing on each book, including number 1, the background of the book, 2, the author of the book, 3, the date it was written, or when they feel it was written. Number 4, the content. You just do a brief, your book helps you. It'll tell you when you go through this, it tells you. And 5, a brief outline. Okay, you do it brief, and then you compile this into a journal or a paper to be turned in at the conclusion. I mean, when I say paper, it doesn't mean in paragraph form. It means just on each book, answer those questions, those areas there that are right there. That's what you turn in next week to me.
all 27.
Exactly. Okay, now, I want to say a couple of things about the book of Hebrews, and then we're going to go through the study sheet. Okay? There is and some of you already know this, there's a huge controversy in the Christian theological circles on who wrote the book of Hebrews.
Of course it was Paul.
So, okay, was it Paul? Was it Barnabas? Some people believe it was Barnabas. Some people believe it was Apollos. And then some people even, I remember somebody said that maybe it was Priscilla, Aquila and Priscilla that had the church in their house, because they were thinking that maybe there was at least one female author in the Bible. I don't know. Anyway, there's all these different theories. And number 1, you've got to realize, I love the book of Hebrews. It's an absolutely exceptional book. It's different from all the other books of the New Testament. It's sort of like John is different from all the other Gospels. And it includes information that really total revelation information. Okay, I'm talking revelatory. It was. But the person that wrote Hebrews would have to have a complete and thorough knowledge of the Old Testament and Jewish rituals, sacredness, ceremonies. They would have to be Jewish through and through. Well, Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, and he was schooled in all that. And he was very knowledgeable, and he was very strict in keeping the law, and he knew it backwards and forwards and that kind of thing. Plus, there's a place there in Hebrews where it says, I, Paul, and some people say that there's parts of Hebrew that is not the kind of verbiage that Paul would use. Some people believe that part of it was written by Paul and then someone took it and made notes and put other things in there. So what do I believe? I believe Paul wrote the book myself, but that doesn't mean that it's correct. How will we ever know? I don't think we're going to know until we get to heaven, for sure who it is. But anyway, you could read about that on Hebrews, and of course you'll go through to do your journal on the book of Hebrews. In pages 335 to 364, it goes into detail about it. The other thing I want to talk about before we pass out the study sheets is, we'll get to that though. We'll get that on the study sheet about Revelation. See, this class is not on Revelation, so we can't go into detail about it because we don't have time. Yes? Oh, yes. Thank you. And for those of you listening on Zoom, this study sheet will be emailed to you, and so you'll have it. You will have it there. This is the study sheet to prepare you for next week for the exam. Okay, now notice at the very top, I want you to notice, study the following material for your final exam next week. If you know this material, you will do well on the exam, as the exam will include some of this material. Your exam will not include all of this. But you don't know which ones it will include. So you got to, this is a study guide to go by, okay? All right, so number one, define the following: canon, province, the provincial government, the Hellenistic kingdom, apocrypha, testament, covenant. Okay, yes, John?
We'll be allowed to use our books during the exam?
I don't know.
What about I know?
You're going to be able to use your Bibles for sure. Okay, number two, what is the true biblical criteria for canonicity? We went over that the first week. That's at the very back of your book, on all that on the canon. Okay, use scriptural reference. There's one scriptural reference. I'll give you that clue. It isn't a bunch of them. It's just the one. Okay. 3, what are the 3 ways we know when something is inspired? What are the 3? And it's in your book there in the back, in that part on the canon. Explain each in some detail. Now, when we mean in some detail, we're talking about like little bullet points or just brief, okay? 4, give the 4 ways to determine when something is to be included in the canon and explain briefly. 5, what are variants? We talked about the variant manuscripts. How do they creep into the text? Name and define the 4 classes in the pagan society at the time of Christ. 7, what were the main languages spoken during the time of Christ? Now, there were like 3 or 4 main languages. That was it. How did that impact the spread of the gospel? How did those 4 languages impact the spread of the gospel? Especially one of them, okay? 8, name the 4 general sections that Palestine is divided into. Which section was most populated? We went over that tonight. What distinguished Jesus' teaching from that of the scribes? Remember? How many of you remember? That's right from the Bible. What did the people say? He doesn't teach like the scribes. He teaches with,
Authority.
that's it. See, that's the answer to that question right there. See, some of these are more simple than you think, okay? 10, name the 5 major teaching methods he employed. This is there, it's written in your book. Name the 5 major the 5 major teaching methods that Jesus employed. 11, what purposes were served by teaching in parables? There was a purpose served by that. Name the 5 major religious beliefs present at the time of Christ. We went over this, it's in your book. It was like this second or third week. I think it was the second week. Name the 7 major philosophies present at the time of Christ and share their major tenets. Okay. 14, explain the difference between the temple and the synagogue. Okay, somebody tell me. Let's just.
The synagogue is a place to worship and learn that the Jews would build when they were taken into captivity. The temple was Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There's only one temple.
But what was the main thing that distinguished the temple from the synagogue?
The Ark of the Covenant.
No, that's significant, but no, there's one major thing.
The temple was for sacrifice.
They could only sacrifice at the temple. They could not sacrifice at synagogues. So all the time that they didn't have a temple, they weren't able to sacrifice for their sins or the sins of the nation.
Which is why
Very, very significant, and it really got to them. And that's why they were so intent to come back and rebuild a temple.
So you mean for all this time that like the Dome of the Rock has been on the Temple Mount?
That's why they are looking and crying for the Messiah to come and for the temple to be rebuilt there. Oh, I'm telling you, it's when you know the story of the Jewish people and how so many of them have been true to those laws and to God, and how they've suffered for it, and how they are yearning for that temple to be rebuilt. You can see how they're going to be so deceived by the Antichrist, because he's going to build that temple for them, and they're going to think he's the Messiah. Okay, what are the 3 ways to classify the contents of the New Testament? And there's 3 ways, and we went over it. And we went over it tonight, right here. The 3 ways are right there. Okay. Explain in detail what the synoptic problem is. You guys remember the synoptic problem? And the most accepted solution to it. Well, now see, some of these questions will not be on here. Also, some of them might be shortened. Okay. The New Testament is comprised of how many books written by how many authors over a period of how many years? Write from memory the books of the New Testament. What are the 5 major divisions of Acts and their scriptural reference? Okay, that is outlined in your book there, and even in the table of contents. Share as much biographical information about Paul as you are able. So this would be just like short bullet points. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was raised in Tarshish, whatever. Okay. His Hebrew name was Saul, What 2 biblical books are known as the literature of protest? What 2 biblical books are known as the literature of protest? Okay, that's in your book. And what were they dealing with? Well, to give you, right now, just to give you an answer that's in your book, the 2 books that are known as the literature of protest are Galatians and James. And you'll see what they're dealing with. You can look that up. Name the 2 main problems Paul encountered in Ephesus. Okay, you'll read that in your book when he wrote the book of Ephesians. The 2 main problems, and one of them is the problem we're having right now today. One of them was the worship of Diana, the goddess. and they had a temple to her there, and they made their living from that, most of them. All these artisans, you know, it's just like, let's say you were a blacksmith. You were a blacksmith in the days of the horses, and you had a blacksmith shop, and you made your living from that, and you made these horseshoes and other type of things like that, okay, and whatever. But everybody came to the blacksmith shop just like we go to the gas station and the change your oil place and, you know, the car repair place and that kind of stuff, okay? So everybody's going to the blacksmith shop to get their horseshoes, and they pay you, you know, you make your living that way, and all of a sudden somebody says, you can't do that, it's not right. Or, you know, well, actually all the blacksmith shops pretty much went out of business after the cars were invented and manufactured, you know, little by little they went out of business. And so those people lost their livelihood after they'd learned that trade. All right, so these people in Ephesus, a lot of them earned their living by making these statues of Diana and trinkets and, you know, whatever. And some of them were made out of gold and silver and precious things like that. It was a very lucrative business, okay? And because she was worshipped there, women had, it was a cult of Diana, a seat of the cult of Diana, and women were dominant, okay? Then you've got the Asian influence, which is right by there. Remember that religion from Asia where the mother god, whatever she was, that pagan mother god, and they worshipped her. And if you've ever known much about China, it's called a matriarchal society. Have you ever heard that in history? Matriarchal society, China. What does that mean? Mama rules. The mother rules. I do know that we had some Chinese people in our Christians, good Christian people in our church in San Carlos, and through acquaintance with them and knowing them all through those years and everything, they were wonderful people. But it was their custom. The Chinese do not spank their girls. They spank the boys, but they don't spank the girls. I mean, I don't know if they do to this day, but this is what they used to do. They would not spank the girls at all, but they spanked the boys. Okay. But they also, the Asians, the woman was the dominant. Of course, as you study history and you see these religions and these philosophical ideas that pervade a whole culture and society, you see where it comes from. Because if they're worshiping the woman as the main goddess and person, then, you know, so this cult of Diana was pervasive, and women were dominant there. And there were other places that were dominant in this area, but this was a real seat of it, okay? So it made a big difference, and it was a big thing. We see it in the world today where women are being completely dominant and replacing men. Men are dishonored over and over and over again and replaced, and it's going to continue to get worse, I can tell you right now. And going into the last days here, the very last days, everything is going to be upside down, perverted, twisted, you know, and that kind of thing. And it's really moving fast in that direction. So anyway, okay, 23. What book was written to defend Paul against the criticisms of the church? All right, what book was written to defend Paul against the criticisms of the church? And I will tell you that was, so you can look it up in your book, but it was 2 Corinthians. And if you read there, you'll see what they were accusing Paul of and how he responded. 24, what is the central theme of the book of Romans? And to whom was it targeted? Okay. The book of Romans is also one of the different books in the New Testament. Very great book and a wonderful book. But it had they all had their purpose. Name and give the dates of writing for the 4 prison epistles. There were 4 of the letters, Paul's letters, that were written while he was in prison. That's why they're called the prison epistles. Give the dates of the writing of the 4 prison epistles. Name the pastoral epistles in the order in which they were written. Okay, Paul wrote pastoral epistles. 27, explain as much biographical data on Timothy as you are able. So like Timothy, who was his mother? Who was his grandmother? Where did he come from? His father was Greek. His mother was Hebrew or Jewish. Anyway, you just give a few points about that. 28, give as much biographical detail as you can about Peter. You know, those things are the things that are known about Peter. Share the 2 major themes espoused in 1 Peter. What are the 2 major themes there? Why was the book of Hebrews written? And to what major group? 31, what was the major reason for the writing of 2 Peter, Jude, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? There was a major reason for those books at that time and the things they were facing in the culture, the philosophies and the doctrinal errors and that kind of stuff. 32, what is the major theme in 2 Peter? See, 31 says, what's the major reason for the writing of 2 Peter, Jude, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? 32 is what is the major theme in 2 Peter and the 3 major sections of the book. 33, what is the distinctive literary character of the book of Jude? Okay, what is the distinctive literary character of the book of Jude? 34, name and briefly describe the 4 main schools of interpretation for the book of Revelation. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Name and briefly describe the 3 major millennial views in Revelation. Okay, the last 2 we want to spend a little time on here. Okay, so look in your book on, where's mine? Here it is. We're going to look in, beginning with page 381. And we can't get into a lot of detail, but we're just going to highlight some things so you kind of know. All right. Revelation is apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic, we know, apocalyptic is, the kind of stuff that happens, like all the imagery and symbolism and prophetic things to come to pass in the end, and the symbolism, the the disasters, the war between Jesus and Satan, all those kind of things, apocalyptic. Okay, we're going to look at the 4 main schools of interpretation of the book of Revelation. I should have brought my other sheet. Where is that sheet that I had ready for you guys? I mean, I don't think I brought it. Let me see. Okay, anyway, let's turn in your book on page 386. Okay, the 4 main schools of interpretation. Number 1, the preterist school. Okay. The preterist school holds that the symbolism of Revelation relates only to the events of the day in which it was written. That when it was written back there in the 1st century, that it only pertains to that. All the imagery of the seals and trumpets and vials have no bearing on the future. The writer was simply expressing his moral indignation concerning the abuses of his own day when he spoke of future judgment. That's the preterist view. No, we do not That is not our view, is not the view of the Assemblies of God or any Pentecostal denomination or any denomination that believes the Bible literally, okay? Okay, the second view is the idealist view. The idealist view is closely associated with the preterist school. It considers Revelation to be only a symbolic picture of the enduring struggle between good and evil and between Christianity and paganism. It holds that its symbols cannot be identified as historic events either in the past or in the future. They are simply trends or ideals. They are symbols, okay? That's the idealist school. The idealist method of interpretation does focus the attention of the reader on the ethical and spiritual truth of Revelation rather than on the debatable aspects of its symbolism. But on the other hand, it tends to undervalue that symbolism as a vehicle of predictive prophecy. It doesn't believe in it being predictive prophecy, for the future. Okay, the historist school, I can't hardly say that word. Anyway, school, at the bottom of page 386. Okay, the historist interpretation holds that Revelation outlines in symbolic form the entire course of history of the church from Pentecost to the advent of Christ. That it outlines in symbolic form, all this time from Pentecost to the advent of Christ. And that these symbols portray in sequence the great events that have taken place through history. That is, the seals are the breakup of the Roman Empire, they feel. The eruption of locusts from the bottomless pit is a picture of the Mohammedan invasions, etc. Each major event in the history of Christendom was thus broadly foreshadowed, so that Revelation becomes a calendar of events written in advance, but that have taken place down through history. So the historist view is more literal than the idealist view, but its advocates have never achieved unanimity on what the individual symbols mean. They have differing views on this symbol means this in history, this one means this in history, this one means that, They can't have view on it. So they have many, many interpretations. Okay, the futurist school, that's the fourth one. The futurists hold that the first 3 chapters of Revelation apply either to the day in which they were written. The first 3 chapters are the letters to the churches, those 7 churches of Asia. That it applies to that day that it was written and those churches, or else that the 7 churches of Asia represent 7 eras of church history, bridging the gap from the apostolic age to the return of Christ. And my husband and I feel that it's both. That those letters were written exactly to those churches with their problems, and it also foreshadows a time in history, the history of the church, when the church was had those exact problems. We feel like it has both of that element to it. But anyway, the futurists, beginning with the phrase in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, the things which must come to pass hereafter, means that the book of Revelation is now dealing with events that will take place in a period called the Great Tribulation, just preceding the return of Christ. And its length of 7 years. We believe it literally. Okay? The futurist school believes the book of Revelation to be literal and a literal interpretation of the future to come, and it has not been from chapter 4, verse 1, that it has not been fulfilled yet. Okay. And then, so that's just a brief little thing of those it's in your book. The last thing on your study sheet, number 35, name and briefly describe the 3 major millennial views in Revelation. Okay, the 3 major millennial views are, number 1, the post-millennial. Well, anyway, let me tell you, the millennium, as we call the millennial, the word millennial means 1,000 years. It just means 1,000 years. Okay, and it's based on the 20th chapter of Revelation. And if you read that 20th chapter there, it is very, very clear that there's going to be a millennium and it's going to last for 1,000 years. It says 1,000 years over and over. It says those exact words. It doesn't say millennium. It says 1,000 years over and over in that chapter. But anyway, so, and that the 1,000 years will follow the second coming of Christ. The 1,000 years will follow the second coming of Christ. So there are 3 views about the millennium. Number 1, the post-millennial view. The post-millennial view regards the 1,000 years as probably figurative of a long interval that precedes the coming of Christ. At the beginning of the period, the triumph of the gospel over the nations will introduce the reign of peace that will endure until Christ returns in final judgment. Okay. The amillennial view, the prefix "a" in front of a word means not or no. Okay. The amillennial view holds that the millennium is non-existent as a literal period, or possibly that it represents the immediate state of the dead. But it's the amillennial view is basically there's no millennium. Christ may return at any time when he will judge the world and usher in the eternal state of bliss for the righteous, the new heavens and the new earth. But they don't believe in a millennium. Okay. The premillennial view holds that Christ will return personally to initiate his kingdom, that the righteous dead will be raised, like go up in the rapture, that they will reign personally with him on the earth for 1,000 years, just like it says in chapter 20 of Revelation, and that subsequent to his reign there will be a final rebellion that shall be immediately suppressed. The wicked dead will be judged and the eternal state will begin. Okay, so that's just briefly those views. Also, you have a chart there on page 389 about these different views. Okay, so that you can just kind of get an overview of it. All right. All right. Now, does anyone, by the way, there are only about, this has 35 questions here. There are only about 20 questions on the test, 18 or 20. So there's a significant amount of this material that is not there, okay? But as you study and just kind of have an idea of this general idea, you'll do fine. And so I know everybody's tired. And any questions on any of the assignments? Next week, you got to turn in your journals on all these New Testament books. Yes?
Is it okay if we email our journals to you?
Yes, you can email them to me. Yes.
I barely can write my notes.
And
I have a question.
yes. Yes, you can email the journals or the assignments to me.
So it was earlier you were talking about the Temple of Diana. These people had to make the little figurines and stuff.
Yeah, right. They made their
Right.
living that way.
So I have a question about that. Is that where in I think it's First Timothy in chapter 3, he's talking about not to let because there's a lot of people that don't believe in women pastors, and because in the
Right.
Bible it says to
About
let
the
him
women,
be
the
a man
woman
with
problem.
one wife and not let her be head of the church, something like that. Is that because of that time? Because of when the Temple of Diana was going on? I think that was the
Well,
period
there was a lot of
Dominance, right?
dominance, but there was a lot of worship of gods and goddesses.
Mhm,
See, Paul was in the Gentile world.
mhm,
He wasn't in the Jewish world. Okay. Number one, one of the things they criticized Paul for was because he worked. I'm talking about some of these Jewish believers. Okay. You know, because the Jewish church, they supported their pastors because they had been taught to tithe from day one growing up as a Jew. You understand? You know, it's just like us growing up as a Christian and we teach our children to tithe, okay? But if we go out somewhere, we're a missionary in China or, you know, wherever, to heathen people or pagan people, secular people that have never known that, and, you know, they have no revelation on it, and you're trying to evangelize them. Well, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to get a secular job and work while you're evangelizing, okay? Well, that's what Paul did, and that's what he had to do, you know. But he was criticized for that, okay? So he's also in a pagan culture where everything is perverted.
mhm.
You know, they've got all kinds of sexual perversion, and they have all kinds of perversion as far as male and female, just like we have today, okay? And so a lot of the situation that Paul was dealing with and addressing as far as women in ministry had to do with that problem in secular, you know, in the secular church. And what's significant is in Acts, you read about Philip having 4 daughters who were evangelists. And
Right.
you read about in the Old Testament several women who were prophetesses.
Mhm.
Okay, not only Huldah the prophetess was mentioned in the time of, it was in the Kings and Chronicles. It was in one of the Kings. She was a prophetess. She was a real prophetess. I think Miriam was a prophetess, and that's why she was used by the Lord to sing that song of prophecy after they crossed the Red Sea. And of course, Deborah was a judge and a prophetess, okay? And Isaiah's wife was a prophetess. When you read the book of Isaiah, he talks about his wife, the prophetess, okay? There were others that were never named, of course.
Mhm.
And then you come down to the New Testament. Well, the Jewish people were familiar with women being used in their churches, but they never usurped authority over a man. Ever. The Jewish people were taught the right order. Okay? But the secular pagan people world that Paul went to, it was like, I mean, it's like you went to Hollywood and, you know, all kinds of whatever is turned around backwards and da-da-da-da-da. And so you're going to have to put your thumb on some of that stuff. Okay, so yes, it was that kind of a thing. But what we're facing today in this militant world, militant on every hand. I mean, remember, was it just yesterday? I think my husband read to me those policemen that were shot in Houston by trying to serve that warrant to those 2 drug dealers. It was several, about like 5 policemen serving this warrant to these drug dealers. They just had to serve a warrant, and they just opened fire on them, and some of them were critically wounded, these policemen. I hope none of them died, but they were very critically wounded. And so we got this militant world. We've got militant men. We have militant women, very, very militant. And the big push now is for women to show their stuff in a man's world. And we've had it for a long time, but I mean, it is coming to the forefront. I mean, fast. That's why there's a big push to have a woman president here in the United States. England's had a woman prime minister more than once. India had a woman prime minister. There's been other women leaders in the world, but America has never had a female president. And it isn't just that they want a female president. They want a militant female president that kind of stomps men under their feet. I'm talking about this militant, violent movement, all right? It's going to get worse in these last days. I believe that's why the Lord is going to use more women in these last days in his church and in, all right, he's going to have to. I don't say that in the wrong way. I mean, God knows what to do in a society when it's, but the women of God should always, ministers and women who called of God should always, number one, honor God with their calling in their life, and number two, honor men. Yeah. And that isn't always done. And no matter what situation, there are women ministers who are not pastors. There's more women pastors now than there ever has been. Well, yes, but we're going to see more and more of that. But there's a way that God would ordain it or want it done. And there are many times that men would feel dishonored if a woman was their pastor. There are times when they wouldn't. When God raises up a woman to pastor, and he really raises it up, he's going to work it out, and it's going to be the right setting, it's going to be the right place, the right calling. And there's been a lot of women used in ministries that weren't necessarily like a church, like pastoring a church, okay, on the mission field. God sent many, many women where men would never go, or men would have never been left alive. One remarkable story is Chasing the Dragon. If you've never read that book, it's an absolutely awesome book. And it's the story of Jackie Pullinger, she's about my age right now. And God sent her to the walled city of China. Okay, it's no longer there. They tore down that wall. But in the midst of the walled city of Hong Kong, okay, they've got a wall in China, but the walled city of Hong Kong. She was from England. She was from Great Britain, and she was a teacher, an instructor. And she wasn't from a Pentecostal denomination, but God began to deal with her, and she just felt like she was supposed to go. They had a great church, and she just had this feeling she was supposed to go somewhere and do something for God. But she didn't know where it was, and she didn't have any direction on that. She went to her pastor, talked to him, and said, told him, and he said, here's the wisdom the Lord gave him. He said, if you really feel this, just sell what you have, buy a ticket as far as it'll go, and get off. And that's what she did. And she wound up in Hong Kong. The ticket on the ship took her to Hong Kong. And when she got off, she didn't know anybody. They said, who do you know here? You had to have somebody that you know for them to let you, live there. She wasn't just going as a tourist. And all she had was a little bit of money, and she'd bought most of it. She had used most of her money to buy that ticket. And she said she remembered her father he was a businessman, and he had dealings in Hong Kong because, they had trade agreement. They used to be a British colony, Hong Kong was. And so she remembered her dad, this one man that he did business with there. And she remembered that guy's name, and she said, this person, he knows me and my family. Well, they contacted the guy, and he says, yes, I know this family. And they let her stay. That's how she got to Hong Kong. The rest of the story is, you won't even believe it. It's so amazing. And how God sent her into this walled, Chasing the Dragon.
Chasing the Dragon.
Yeah, this walled city of Hong Kong was a 1 square mile, It was all walled in, and the police, the Chinese police wouldn't even go in there. The Hong Kong police would not set foot in it. It was absolutely a drug-infested den of prostitution, every kind of vice you can imagine. It was horrible, and it was, and it was filthy. It was a den of iniquity, the whole thing. Opium dens, and it was just, and these guys that controlled these women, these prostitutes, they were sold into prostitution. Anyway, after she got there, and they tried to kick her out over and over. They did all this stuff and everything. And one of them told her one time, if you had been a man, you would have already been dead. But because you were a woman, we wouldn't kill you. God knew what he was doing. But anyway, it was like the Teen Challenge. It was like when Dave Wilkerson, when God sent him to New York City. Okay, I'm telling you. Anyway, she eventually got filled with the Holy Spirit, and the rest is history. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing what God did through her. And now that whole walled city, the walls around that part have been torn down. It's been completely cleaned up, and it's a beautiful park now. But the amazing ministry she did that continues to this day is, so God there are many places that God will send a woman that a man can't go. Right, or even that a man won't go because it's more designed for what a woman would do. But it doesn't mean a woman can't pastor or can't be a co-pastor. There are many husband and wife teams that co-pastor together, and my husband and I are one of them, and we believe in women in ministry. And I'm glad I was brought up to believe in women in ministry. My dad was brought up Methodist. The Methodists believed in women in ministry.
A lot of denominations don't.
But years ago, it wasn't prevalent,
It's not even just denominations now. It's a lot of times people.
Right. But those walls are being broken down, and look how God used Joyce Meyer. Oh my! And see, she's not a pastor.
She's not?
No, she's a minister, but she's not. She doesn't pastor a church.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she doesn't pastor a church. She just.
She pastored me.
Oh no! I mean, she's a pastor in that sense that she pastors.
She doesn't have a church.
Yeah, she doesn't have. Yeah, she's not the senior pastor of a church. So so I think sometimes we're confused by the words that we use. When I talk about a pastor, when I'm talking about pastor, I'm talking about a senior pastor of a church or a pastor like associate pastor at a church. Okay, but it doesn't mean that a minister who ministers like Joyce Meyer isn't a pastor to some people, but she's not a senior pastor of a church.
Right.
And you can see how the Lord prepared her for that and prepared her husband, Dave, for his role in their ministry. And he doesn't like to speak and preach. He doesn't want to. He speaks on one of the things that he loves, and that's part of his calling, is calling people back to the roots of what this country was founded on. And he will speak on that. He has these sessions on that, and he puts stuff on there. But he oversees so much of that ministry, and he does the part that Joyce doesn't do, and he's perfectly fine with that. Well, the Lord planned that, you see. Then there are some ministers that the man is the main speaker and minister and pastor, and his wife is not a speaker. She's not a co-pastor. She's very supportive. She feels called to be a pastor's wife, but she's maybe involved here and there, but she's not real involved, okay? Then there are other couples that both the husband and wife minister and are anointed to preach or teach or to really be involved. So, God's got all kinds of people.
He's got a mix up.
Right, and the Lord has...
He knows what he's doing. I think.
Well, he knows what each person is gifted for and what he's called them to, and the purpose for which they're called. Okay, so
This is a good one.
God bless everybody. We're going to stop the recording.
Almost.
Up here.
We'll try to-
Where is it? Right here?
Yeah.
Okay, bye everybody. God bless you. Next week is the final exam.